So welcome to the Punch Bowl, everyone. My name is Hannah Zimmerman, and I am the Marketing and Communications Director at Historic Locust Grove. We are so pleased that you are with us today. From wherever you are, wherever we are in about 5 different states right now. If you are not from Kentucky, New York, Virginia, Pennsylvania, or Indiana, please do let us know. We're also in several states of mind this evening on what is the best, and we're going to define the best this evening as best as we possibly can. And who better to kick us off than the best Locust Grove program director I know, Brian Cushing. Take it away, Brian.
Thank you so much. Welcome back to the Punch Bowl. This is our 3rd installment. Glad y'all are here with us. Just a couple of reminders to please keep your mics muted and to ask questions in the chat, and then we'll get to them that way. A couple of shout outs that I want to give tonight as we're getting started. One is to our attendees, Asha and Aiden, congratulations on your recent marriage. They're currently enjoying Fish House Punch and Ruby Port we see in the chat. I also want to shout out to all those distillers out there that have stepped up and use our facilities to make hand sanitizer. I think we've got a few of those with us here tonight. It really struck me. We had a special election here in Kentucky a few weeks ago, and at the polls, they had a hand sanitizer dispenser there for everybody. And as soon as it came out, I knew from the smell of it what kind of facility it came from. So since we're talking about distilling tonight, we have some great distillers here with us. Just thank you to all of you who have stepped up during this very strange time. The idea of the Punch Bowl is just like the Super Bowl in every way, except for if there's no sports, there's just drinking. We're going to have a little showdown about regional styles tonight, and the Punch Bowl is an extension of the Odyssey Initiative. And the Odyssey Initiative is a movement created by Colonial Williamsburg to take advantage of this time as an opportunity to innovate and collaborate with other cultural institutions throughout the country in an attempt to extend our overall reach and discover new ways to interpret our collective history and collections. Beginning with a collaboration between Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, and Historic Locust Grove in Louisville, Kentucky, museums will collaborate across a variety of online platforms, sharing resources they have to demonstrate the settling of European immigrants from the Virginian beginnings to the territory of Kentucky. And we have, the idea is to expand and to include as many institutions as possible. And we see here tonight, we have both museums and people working in the for-profit sector of the distilling world who are very interested in this history and this culture, and have all helped us out here at Locust Grove. So we have had a tradition over the past several episodes to have a Toastmaster to offer some toasts. That has been Brian Austin up to this point, who plays James Madison at Colonial Williamsburg. It was him and Hannah Zimmerman, our marketing director, who you just met, who really hatched this whole idea and got it rolling. But he was not available tonight, so we knew we had to have somebody special. So we have brought here tonight to give our toasts the one, the only, George Rogers Clark. Take it away.
Thank you, good sir Brian. Always a pleasure to be with you and with all of you. First, I have a few toasts to offer. If we're asking to play favorites, I must play my favorite, Kentucky County. So if you will, let's raise a glass to Kentucky County, a richer and more beautiful country than this, I believe, has never been seen in America yet. To Kentucky County.
You're here.
Now, I wish to propose a toast. If you will, let me refill my rum ration. I wish to propose a toast to staying young, and this comes with a slight anecdote. 2 old ladies who were known to be the same age had the same desire to keep the real number concealed. One, therefore, used to always, upon New Year's Day, go to the other and say, "Madam, I'm come this year to know how old are we to be this year?" To keeping it young. Brian, I'll hand it back to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Colonel. You still Colonel, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. Right. Okay, so reminder to keep your mics muted. Ask the questions in the chat, and we'll get to them that way. And I would like to introduce who we have here with us today. First, we have Steve Bayshore from Mount Vernon. Steve is the Director of Historic Trades out there and the Master Distiller and Master Miller at Mount Vernon. We have Alan Bishop, who is a Master Distiller at Spirits of French Lick and has been down there with us quite a bit lately at Locust Grove. Erin Hollis is the Education Director at West Overton Village. She'll be representing Pennsylvania tonight. And once again, joining us, that sorceress of all things spirituous, Lisa Wicker, the Master Distiller at Widow Jane Distillery. So welcome back, everybody.
Glad to be back.
Good to see you.
So let's kind of everybody take a few minutes to intro. Everybody's not necessarily going to be talking about the region that they're working in, but at least what it is that they think really adds up to the best, what they really consider the quintessential, the top of the line, their favorite, and why. So we're gonna go around the room, so to speak, and take however much time you need to say that, to make your case. And if anybody has any thoughts, if anybody wants to vote, feel free to do that in the chat, and we'll see where we get. So kicking us off is Steve Bayshore. How you doing, Steve?
Good, Brian. Thank you. Lucky me, I get to go first. Historically, I think we talked about a couple punch bowls ago that it's really hard to identify a distinctive Virginia spirit, unlike Maryland or Kentucky later, or Pennsylvania. But there's no doubt in the 18th century that rye was huge in Virginia. But I found a lot of references to corn whiskey as well, and even some very early 19th century Virginia wheat whiskeys. So I would say it's a pretty diversified profile that was coming out of Virginia in the 18th century and even earlier. I think, we don't have records existing that I've found that go back into the 1600s, but there's no doubt that in the early period they were distilling, as most of those immigrants did. And the other aspect, which wields its way across all these colonies that become states, is the brandy aspect in Virginia was pretty big. Apple and peach, and even we have records of persimmon brandy being made at Mount Vernon. So I think if you think of, we talked about distilling is really farming, and so what came out of the land they utilized. In the modern sense, I could always make the joke that Kentucky was part of Virginia, but we've been down that road before. But I think that the same thing applies, that there's a great number of Virginia distilleries that are doing a lot of creative work across the state based on the history, but they're also branching out like is happening in the craft world all over. But I think that, people like A. Smith Bowman Distillery is making some really fine bourbons that come out of Fredericksburg area. Catoctin Creek with Becky Harris today is making some fantastic rye and other whiskeys. So I think we probably fold in pretty well to what's going on in the modern world, but Virginia can claim the earliest distillation. I guess that's where I'd strike my claim, 1619. So if anybody can beat 1619, I know Massachusetts can't. They're not here, but they were landing the next year. But it probably tasted pretty horrible, but it was being made in 1619. That's my case anyway.
Alan Bishop, welcome back to the show. I bet you have some pretty strong words for us.
Yeah, I mean, Hoosiers are nothing if they're not a little bit mouthy, especially if they're from the southern part of the state. You have to be, right? I mean, we're in Bourbon's backyard, so, obviously, you guys have got the PR firm to make things happen, and we have to fire a small can in your direction and strike first. So what I would argue is that all of you guys are on the East Coast, right? With the exception of Brian, you're in Kentucky, all right? Well, I was in the frontier. So what we did is we just took everything that you guys did, we brought it to Indiana, and then we did it better. So I'm going to argue for a style of spirit that many people listening are not aware of, or a style of distillation that many people listening are not aware of, from a very particular region of my state, which is a 6-county region known as the Black Forest of Southern Indiana, Washington, Orange, Lawrence, Crawford, Harrison, and Perry counties, where between 1855 and 1914 existed 155 mostly apple brandy distilleries, making a very particular style of Hoosier apple brandy. And they were also making bourbon at the time. I know people tend to think of bourbon as being a Kentucky thing, but from a historical perspective, interestingly enough, bourbon at its heart is a corn whiskey. And, limestone water is in a lot of the other states that surround Kentucky, including Southern Ohio, Southern Indiana. The majority of bourbon in the early days was shipped downriver from Maysville, Kentucky, which is right on the river. But one aspect that people have not thought about in a lot of ways, particularly from from the early 1800s up through 1830, is how much of that bourbon might have actually been made across the river on quote unquote the wrong side of the river, because you had to cross the Ohio River in order to ship downstream if you were north of New Albany, Indiana, because otherwise you'd lose everything at the Falls of the Ohio. So I speculate that probably 20 to 30% of the bourbon that was actually leaving Maysville, Kentucky by that time was probably coming from Indiana and Ohio as well, southern Indiana and Ohio. But again, the big claim to fame is Hoosier Apple Brandy, which really started here about 1806. A man named John Fleener, just north of Salem, Indiana. Fleener was ironically originally from Virginia, where his father was a distiller of apple brandy, and came here with his own cultivars of apples and peaches and set to work very early on making those brandies. A lot of German culture here in southern Indiana. Those 6 county regions by 1855, each of those 6 counties in that region had upwards of 155,000 plus apple trees. At the time, there was really no shipping out of the state of Indiana. Cider was never a big thing in the state of Indiana, and these apples were literally grown from seed every year, so they're being selected just for brandy production. By the late 1800s, we actually hosted the largest brandy distillery in the entire world, which was the Alexander Sterling and David Kemper Distillery in Harrison County, Indiana, New Amsterdam, right along the Ohio River. And those guys were making about 1,200 barrels a year. May not sound like a lot, but kind of put it in perspective, you're talking from 1 to 3 bushels of apples to make 1 gallon of brandy. And the brandy was regarded as higher quality than what was being made in Normandy, France. One other thing, and I've got to keep going back at Brian because I know he's going to come from bourbon country. So I gotta just hit back wherever I can, right? Because I know it's coming. I know the war is coming. So the one thing about apple brandy that people don't realize, especially Hoosier apple brandy, is that when you really break it down, the style is a lot different. It's a lot bigger. It's a lot bolder. It's a lot heavier. It really has more in common with bourbon than it does French apple brandy. But the beautiful thing about it is that really Hoosier apple brandy, well, apple brandy in general, is basically bourbon's kind of more attractive older sister. So that's where we'll start at.
See. Well, now let's not forget, I think I'm next on the list if we're going in alphabetical order. If it hadn't been for Kentucky, the British were pretty dead set on having you making Canadian whiskey in the War of 1812. They almost did it. But of course, then there was Kentucky. So yeah, I'm lucky to live with a spirit that I really do believe in. I think I introduced it before as we were kind of talking. I decided to make the most gratuitously Kentucky thing I could think of. It is the first documented recipe for a bourbon-based mint julep written by Henry Clay in 1847. You can't get much more Kentucky than that. I'm using a bourbon produced in Lisa's neck of the woods, Old Bardstown, down there at the Willet Distillery. So yeah, bourbon was really, I think, the first spirit that I really decided I liked and that I really believed in when I was discovering spirits. And I think I kind of came at this probably backwards from a lot of people. But to me, I don't know, it's just the perfect spirit. There's something honest about it. It developed from the circumstances that were going on here. It wasn't a deliberate thing, really. It popped up from what the people were dealing with in Kentucky in those early days. And so at Locust Grove, it's been a real privilege to work on telling the story of early Kentucky whiskey, because we're looking at how bourbon came to be. And so it's been great. It's something I can really get behind. I love the color. I love the flavor. Some of these things are just a work of art when you pour them in the glass. I recently discovered Jeff the Creed. My Lord, is just, heaven in your mouth. So there's something honest about it. There's something pure about it. I do like that. I do like that there is only a certain classification of thing that can be bourbon, and if you deviate from that, it's not bourbon. And I think that there's just a real honesty about that, and it really keeps people. It really keeps people working with their skill, working with their creativity, because even within those constraints, there's a lot of creativity and a lot of skill that can be done. So that's it's a personal preference. I love a lot of different spirits. Sometimes I love those spirits because they just remind me how wonderful bourbon is, right, when I go back to it. So that's kind of my patriotic Kentucky diatribe on our native spirit here. And I will now throw it to Aaron Hollis in Pennsylvania.
Nice, thanks. I see we have somebody here from the Bradford House in Washington, Pennsylvania, home of the Whiskey Rebellion. So thanks for being here and helping me represent rye whiskey, because clearly we're already the underdog here. I do want to start by saying something quickly about West Overton, because that is probably the least well-known historic site that we have represented here against Colonial Williamsburg and Mount Vernon and such. West Overton starts in 1803 with a family of German Mennonites who are farmers that moved west from Bucks County near Philadelphia. And they settle on the western side of the state. And that we're about 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, if you're at all familiar with Pennsylvania. And they start a modest family farm of about 260 acres. And from the very beginning, like many farmers in Western Pennsylvania, they have a distillery. And they have a 2-pot still distillery, a capacity of about 75 gallons. And they join a culture of farmers in this area of the world who are either have a still or have access to one. And so, like we've said before, whiskey is inherently an agricultural product, and these farmers are making rye. Rye grain is what they know. Many of the people in this area are German, they're Dutch, and they had been growing rye grain in their area of Europe for hundreds of years. And rye has been grown for thousands. So rye is what they knew, and rye is what they distilled as an agricultural and an economic product. So the Overholts, though they're Mennonites, are no exception to that role. And they open a commercial distillery in 1810. And to make a very long story short, they industrialized that distillery, they industrialized their community over the course of the 19th century. Until the 1870s and 1880s, that 2-pot still distillery has expanded from a log cabin to a 5.5-story red brick distillery that holds the grist mill and distillery under one roof. There are a few hundred people living in this community that is built around this distillery. They also have a coal mine. They have a coverlet weaving factory, and all the auxiliary businesses needed to make this operate, not to mention the few hundred people that are calling this community home. So West Overton is sort of a microcosm of the industrialization of southwestern Pennsylvania over the course of the 19th century. And a big part of that, and why we're here now, is the rye whiskey distillery. So they're growing rye because it's what they know initially. And even as the 19th century rolls on, when they have cleared land better and they can move on to other crops, rye is good. It's a resilient crop. It grows in places sometimes you don't want it to. So it can handle harsh new growing areas. It can handle harsh summers. It can handle harsh winters. And so that's part of why they grow it. But as farmers begin to move on to wheat, they start to think of rye as a poor man's crop. If you can't grow anything else, grow rye. And we seem to think historically that after 1830, rye has kind of peaked and we move on to other things. Nothing else is heard from rye until Prohibition, when it's completely dead. And then we had the resurgence at the end of the 20th century, resurgence in quotations. But I would argue that there's so much more to it than that. And that's sort of what I'm talking about. And to be clear, I'm talking about something called Monongahela rye whiskey. You know, rye whiskey is in itself very nuanced. I think a lot of us think about, well, a lay drinker might think of bourbon, they might think of rye, brandy, but even with all of these, you know, there are so many nuances. And when I'm saying Monongahela rye, I'm talking about whiskey that was made along or near the Monongahela River, which navigates from north central West Virginia and snakes its way through southwestern Pennsylvania, where it forms the Ohio with the Allegheny and Pittsburgh. So these distilleries are getting their water from the Mon or its tributaries. They're growing their grain near this river, and so there's a consistency there. So geographically, that's where it gets its name. Now, we're also talking about a very high rye mash bill. So this is almost exclusively rye with malted barley, or sometimes malted rye. There's no corn in Monongahela rye whiskey. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, these distilleries are steam heating their warehouses. And one distillery employee refers to this as a perpetual summer. So it's summer all year long in these distilling warehouses, which, as you can imagine, greatly impacts the taste and the color of the final product. Monongahela rye is always exclusively a sweet mash, so fresh, sweet, fresh yeast every time that a mash happens, so that no sour mash is happening. And in the late 19th century, it's just an all-around coveted, sought-after whiskey. And I'm not going to lie and say that it outproduced bourbon by any means. I mean, there's more bourbon than rye, like 5 to 1 at the turn of the century. but it is known as King Rye, and people want it. And it certainly doesn't fade away in the early 19th century, but rather a lot of those farmers stick around, and they make, by the end of the century, large bona fide industrial distilling companies. The largest rye whiskey distillery in the world in the 1880s is right here in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. For you local folks, it's the Gibson Distillery near modern-day Monessen. So it was a big deal. It was an industry at the turn of the century, and lots of people worked in them. So just a quick note about that: when Prohibition comes and these distilleries are finally forced to close, not only are employees losing their jobs, but farmers. Rye production is cut by over half between 1920 and 1930. Cooperages, railroad workers, glass workers, all of these auxiliary businesses that support the distilling industry, and this is also true for bourbon and probably brandy, but that's what is the final nail in the coffin for the rye whiskey industry. In 1900, there are 12 distilleries in this county alone, and there are dozens others in the adjacent counties. And what they create is very high quality, unadulterated, pure rye whiskey that that was not found anywhere else. And so finally, come Prohibition, this rye whiskey dies. And only a few distilleries here in southwestern Pennsylvania emerge from Prohibition, but finally, 40s, 50s, they die out. But going back even further quickly, and I promise I'll shut up, going back to the whiskey insurrection, I mean, when colonists decide that they don't want rum anymore because it's British and they can't get it anymore, what do they turn to? They turn to a grain spirit, and they turn to rye whiskey. So from the very beginning, rye is American, even though not originally, and rye is patriotic, and rye whiskey becomes something that's uniquely American. With that point, lost my train of thought there, but it's a patriotic thing. It's what people were fighting over initially, and becomes the first real American whiskey. And I'm sure there's something else I want to say there, so I'll interrupt later, but that's Monongahela Rye.
Does anybody else feel like Aaron just mic dropped us?
Yeah, I was about to say, I feel kind of knocked on the floor at this point, right? I just came out swinging.
Right.
Have
You're
to
focused on the wrong target, Brian.
Well, we got one more left. Lisa, you could claim just about anything, so we are looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, big jump from H to W, right? When I decided alphabetical order. Yeah, last time I joined you, I think I was in my living room in Bardstown, Kentucky, and now I'm in my living room in Brooklyn, New York. I thought I would be in the distillery for this today, and the tropical storm decided to hit us. And one thing about Red Hook that we know is that it used to be marshland originally when it was originally settled, and it likes to flood. Still, we have cobblestone streets, and so they have never, they've only went from mud to cobblestone, and so needless to say, they've taken on a lot of water over the years, but it made more sense for me to be here. Brooklyn, oh my gosh, you know, I'm still distilling in Kentucky as well, but it's pretty remarkable what the history is here. When I first took over this project 3 years ago, the first thing I do is start to, try to figure out what the history is. And every single day we're turning over another stone here, and whether it's directly or indirectly. When Brooklyn was first settled, like down the street from me, I'm actually on the waterfront where I can see lower Manhattan. And so the Dutch settled here. Red Hook was Red Hook. And it was, I can't remember what the translation was. I'm embarrassed to tell you, I cannot tell you what that is. But just up the street here, a couple blocks from me, was a windmill. And they were dotted all over. You see the early agricultural maps for Brooklyn. It's pretty, I don't know how many people are familiar with Brooklyn, but Brooklyn actually used to be really hilly, right? And there's still some hills in certain areas towards Prospect Park and the central part of Brooklyn, but a lot of it's been flattened out. But you see the early agricultural maps of it, especially, Steve and I have talked about this, and we've compared some notes on this, like for some of the Revolutionary War battles, they used the orchards and grain fields as some of their landmarks. So we're talking the early 1600s when the Dutch came here. There's not really any written record. The records that you can find or any reference to it, they were making some really crude spirits with some partially refined sugars. Obviously they were using a lot of, herbs and things to flavor those because they probably were not palatable, right? So, and then transition over the years, then you can see lots of orchards that were planted. There's a big brandy tradition here. and all the way up the Hudson River Valley and out into the western part of the state. So we're talking brandies, we're talking rums, because Barbados to Brooklyn, right? Straight, you know, straight up with sugar refining. And so a lot of the raw sugar cane was brought here and actually not refined before it got here, but was refined in Brooklyn when it hit the port here. And so, you know, like I said, we've got cider is still a strong tradition up here, you know, especially in central and western New York State. But we're kind of looking at everything. My new project here, the warehouse, I had to get a permit, and they're like, well, we can't permit you for this X, Y, and Z exemptions unless your space has been previously used for the same thing. And I'll be darned that we found out that it was a sugar refinery and a 150-year-old warehouse, right? Sugar refinery. And then I found out later that it had been a rum distillery as well. And so I was able to circumvent some of my permitting because of that. Like you said, the area is so old. There's so many accounts of people in Brooklyn. A lot of it was not exported because this area was growing so dramatically, not necessarily Brooklyn, but Manhattan was, that there was a market for things before they even left New York City. But yeah, trying to bring back some of the old traditions, but a lot of them never died here. You know, it was certainly, as we've discussed before, a regular household chore in New York, and in Brooklyn in particular. Nobody let anything go to waste and turned it into spirits. One of our warehouses currently, where I'm storing barrels, was actually, the locals believe that one wall of it was one of the original warehouses that was commissioned by the British government for their goods in the mid to late 18th century. And we still have the one rock wall in our basement, and it's a little spooky, but it's cool. Yeah, so anyway, but yeah, every time you turn a corner here, in the shadows where I'm building the new distillery here, in the shadows of it is the most massive grain mill you've ever seen. And it supplied most of New York State into Pennsylvania, the breweries and distilleries with grain. So, some good stuff going on here.
So Lisa, I got to put you on the spot. If it's at the end of a long day and you're going to reach for something and not even think about it, what is it?
It's bourbon.
So we have an ally here.
Let's just say poor Brooklyn is limping right now, right? There's Brooklyn, you know, when I got back, Brooklyn's a little beat up right now. And so we've had some particularly long, interesting days here. And yesterday was, so I pulled out the tumbler yesterday and a bottle of a friend's bourbon. And yeah, that was dinner.
Nice.
We've all been there.
Yeah. Yeah, poor Brooklyn. Yeah, it's, you know, the people that are still here are, you know, especially in these neighborhoods, a lot of people have left, and you know, people are hanging in there and generally very good spirited and you know, still trying to laugh about what's, you know, if you can't laugh, you cry, right? So anyway, it's yeah, and you know, Brooklyn's been has had its share of things over history, right? Bumps and bruises, and it's just another bruise, unfortunately, right now.
Well, we're glad you're safe and looking forward to having you back in Kentucky with us whenever possible. So before we go any further, we do have a question. Michael Robinson wants to know, why did no one from England escaping during the Great Migration circa 1630 to Massachusetts and Connecticut, why did they not distill? Was it because of their Puritan religion? Anybody have any comments on that before we launch into our defenses of our styles?
Well, they did distill.
Okay.
Not in 1630 maybe, but there's a few rum distilleries in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Connecticut, I'd have to look a little more, but by the mid 1760s, you have 143 rum distilleries along the coast from Georgia all the way up to Boston. So they did take advantage of that trade from the Caribbean. So it was certainly going on.
I do have a little bit of documentation, not from that early, but from at least as early as the 1700s, especially like Connecticut and the further up East Coast that you get. Mostly small, you know, what you would consider home distillers, actually using maple syrup to develop spirits. So that was a fairly common thing up in that area.
Basically rum.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, guys, I'm gonna throw the first punch. I've been through executive urban steward training. It was great down at the at Moonshine University. And we didn't just talk about bourbon. We talked about all the different things people can do in different styles that we can't do in bourbon. We got to keep things pure. All these different things that the Canadians can do and the Scotch can do, they can put in there that aren't actually whiskey. So how do we know what is in these other styles of spirits? I mean, it's the law in bourbon. We know it's pure. How do we know?
The law came in 1964, so we don't know what was in bourbon in 1825.
Well, it's true. I'm talking about drinking it now.
It didn't exist then.
If I got this bottle of Willet,
Oh yeah.
I know what's in it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because for a long time, last 20 years or so, since I've started making alcohol, there's been a push to do some like labeling, right? Ingredient labeling. Project that I did at one point in time, I was sent to Montreal to blend a couple tankers of Canadian whiskey, and I had to go into this like secret lab and everything. So I still don't to this day don't know what label it went under. But because it was so you get thumbprinted and everything. And so I go into the lab and I was floored how many things they could use for Canadian whiskey. It's like,
in there,
holy cow. And then, but you go back into some of the antique whiskeys, and I've got the distillery records from, oh my gosh, it was Buffalo Springs, and it had Greenbrier, and it had several name changes post-prohibition. And the records that I have started in 1934 and ended in 1956. And it's amazing how many additives and things they were using before in 1964, whether it was oak chips or caramel coloring, because they're all documented in the TTB. It wasn't the TTB, it was the ATF then, but records. So that doctoring whiskey was is a tale as old as time, right?
Listen, Brian, us Southern Hoosiers are too honest to be disingenuous about what we put into our spirits. All right, we didn't need a law to tell us what we could and should not put in our spirits. It seemed pretty obvious to us, especially since most of our early distillers over here on this side of the river were building churches off of liquor money, that we wouldn't get anywhere by lying to anybody. So, just saying.
And to Steve's point, they did some pretty nasty things to bourbon back then.
Yes.
Yeah, that is very true.
Well, all those spirits, there's many books that tell people how to add this or that to make it taste like French brandy. I mean, it's as old as man. People are going to try to make something palatable for the market and get it there, and then the salesman will say, "This is 10 years old," and earlier that morning he was doctoring it in some warehouse. So
it's a shame. Shame we don't have anybody from Illinois on here that we could, that was where the big, or Cincinnati, one of the two. We could really just all gang up on them, because those were the two big centers of rectification by the time of industrialization.
Yes. Alan, you forgot St. Louis, yeah.
Yeah, St. Louis as well. Exactly. Pekin, Illinois, the three big distilling states by the late 1800s, they always switch back and forth every year: Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois. But Illinois was because of the massive distilling complex of just rectified whiskeys, and you want to make it a certain color, you put a little tobacco spit in it, maybe use a little creosote, whatever it takes to make it look and taste right.
I was wondering if that was truth or myth, because the stories are that when it was just being shipped in barrels before bottled and bond in the 1890s, which we should probably expand upon here in a second. That why not just siphon some off and fill it with something else while it's being shipped?
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and all that stuff happened. For sure. There's always been unscrupulous people in every line of distilling in every state in the United States, without a doubt. There's always somebody to give us a bad name, for sure.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's a human thing. It's just with a cultural overlay.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bottled and Bond Act happened in the 1890s. It was basically introduced government supervision to bottling of whiskeys. There's a better explanation out there for it than that, but it was the first time when there would be government supervision to a locked warehouse, and you knew what was actually there was certification to what you knew, what was going into that bottle of whiskey. Prior to that, bottled whiskey wasn't even really that big of a thing. You would go and have your jug, your flask, or whatever else filled up at the bar. So that's probably an oversimplified explanation of bottled and bond. But if anybody else has anything to add to that.
Pretty straightforward. But the one thing I would say that probably all of us on here can agree on given the antiquarian attitude that we all probably have towards distillation to some extent, is that all of the spirits that we just talked about were born off of pot stills. And I will always argue that a pot still makes a better spirit than any other mechanism does. But that's just a personal opinion. I would suspect that there are 2 or 3 of you that at least agree with that.
So Eric, you want to take us cold on the mat in the introductions. What's the deal with quality control on rye? How do we look for the best stuff? How do we know what's going on?
Well, I was going to add 2 things there, and the first is about your most recent comment. The bottled and bond and the addition of things like straight onto the bottle was something that local distilleries advocated for and really wanted, because they weren't adding anything to their. Of course, we can think that now looking back, but basically they wanted this because whenever they're making their product, they're losing some liquid to evaporation. And they claimed other rye whiskey distilleries like those in Maryland were adding things like prune juice to make up the difference in volume, so they could charge a lower price because they could increase their volume, whereas this was a more supposedly pure product and didn't have those kinds of additives. So by adding more regulation, then they eliminated that as a problem and made them more competitive in the market. And honestly, I forget what the other thing was. I had read in an agricultural census from 1880, which might be an impartial party, saying that very thing, that the distillers here in southwestern Pennsylvania are producing this pure product, and they're not like the rectifiers or perhaps the shady distillers of, I don't know why they always dump on the Maryland rye whiskey distilleries, but they do. Not like the Maryland distilleries that are adding prune juice. They're not rectifying, they're producing this pure product. So.
Well, the Maryland distillers were definitely pretty open about what they were doing, even in their own literature. They would openly admit to the way that they were blending different stocks and different things of that nature. So I think just like the distilling industry today, the distilling industry has always been to some extent about obviously quality, but also ego. So, when you see somebody doing something that you as a distiller don't agree with, it's hard not to call them out, especially if you can roll it into some sort of marketing thing. So, Pennsylvania has my vote over Maryland. I'll give you that much, Aaron.
That I appreciate.
I don't know though. Hey, Brian, most of the Kentucky distillers, that original 27 families that came to the Bardstown area were from Maryland. This is you.
Gotcha. Yeah. So they worked with what they had with corn and all. Well, first of all, I want to say Alicia Monroe from Punch Bowl 2 is on here with us, and she says flavor over efficiency, pot stills all the way. And I have a feeling Alan's about to drop an elbow. How about current distillers from California developing better bourbon and spirits through chemistry and with spectrometric, I didn't pronounce that right, analysis of popular brands to recreate in the lab?
I'm going to take the Kentucky side on this deal and just point that person to Will McGill versus Seagram's and all the newspaper articles that came out in the 30s about practical distillation versus scientific distillation. So
they keep taking stabs at it though,
Right. The wheel doesn't need reinvented.
Brian. Right.
Well, one thing I think that all of us is being on this point about recreating in a lab versus with pot stills and the way we do things. I think all of us here are into the historic trade nature of distillation. So what are some insights? Of course, you've all done it way more than me. I'm very much the novice here. But what's y'all's take on that? Because I've been with Steve at Mount Vernon. I've been with Alan at Spirits of French Lick. You all do it from an artisan standpoint. What's your take on that versus chemistry?
They both have their use, without a doubt, and there's a fine line in the middle, I believe, that you can easily walk in. And I think out of all of us on here, Lisa probably, because of her experience in the different states she's worked in, different places she's worked at, she can probably walk that line better than what I can. My particular interest has always been in practical distillation, but I'm also odd in that I learned how things work before I knew why that they worked, and then had to go back and learn the chemistry so that I didn't always sound like cornbread every time I was talking to somebody. So, and I think a lot of the traditional distillers in each of the states that we're in right now, unless they were tied in particular to certain lineages and certain even sometimes occult lineages that involve distillation, they probably didn't know how or why things worked the way they did. They just knew how that they worked and that they were practical. And I think the distillation is a lot like any other trade. The more you practice it, the better you get at it. And as long as you're good at using your intuition and you sort of attune your senses to what you're looking for, you can make an extremely great product without ever having to know anything about chemistry itself, other than, you know, that alcohol boils before alcohol boils before water does, etc., and how to separate your different fractions, which a lot of which can be just learned from experience itself. So it's very practical, and you know, it's experiential, and it's all based on feel and the understanding of you know, how you conduct whatever you do. It's just like anything else, you know, you get out of it exactly what you put into it. So
Yeah, I would think that in my limited experience in doing it in the 1790s way, is that there's so many variables in the way we do it that you end up focusing on process more than, and you try to eliminate some of the variables you can identify. And sometimes we can't. And we've learned our building, you know, so we know some things that how they're going to react. But with rye, we had early days where there was a lot of foaming. You know, we conquered that through trial and error. But one thing I've learned from Lisa is it's not really how you follow your book, it's how you react when things go wrong and what adjustments you make in order to get your product done. So, and I also have learned that sometimes for us, following the book isn't always going to work. You need to think a little bit outside the box. But we're very rudimentary. I can't control certain aspects like other facilities can.
Yeah, I'm not a distiller for us. That's what Alicia does. But I would think that you can't become a chemist by experience. You can't really figure out how to be a chemist. And there are so many variables that I don't think people consider when making a particular, you know, run of whiskey, from the type of grain, the variety of grain that you're using, the type of yeast, the climate, what's the situation, the environment and the building. And there's so many that I don't know, so many variables that go into a product that we try to stabilize so we can have consistency. But to try to recreate something from 100 plus years ago is, maybe it's naive, but it just doesn't seem really ideal or plausible even to me.
Well, the good news is I think what we make today at Mount Vernon is probably better tasting than what was around 200
And there's that.
years ago.
Right.
I'm thankful for that.
the other interesting aside is, and I bet Lisa could throw in on this as well, is that from the chemistry point of view, you know, so there's a difference between, you know, knowledge and wisdom. And from the chemistry point of view, you can have all of that knowledge from those books, and you can have all of these rules of, you know, this leads to this, leads to this. But sometimes you get into a distillation system, and all those variables that are there that you guys are talking about don't cause the exact reaction that the book says that it should cause, which kind of keeps you guessing. And that's also the fun of a pot still as well, which I was talking about earlier, because everything affects a pot still. The weather affects it, barometric pressure affects it. If you don't feel good that day, that affects it. So that keeps you on your toes and keeps you constantly learning and moving forward and, you know, evolving your practice and your methodology.
Yeah, chemistry for me is, I sometimes say the best thing that ever happened to me is I'm not a chemical engineer, and the worst thing that ever happened to me is I'm not a chemical engineer. But you know, there's basic chemistry we all use every day, not even realize it. Pretty much for merchantability, you know, when you're doing it just for the romance of it, you don't have to worry about all that. But when you're trying to, like, you know, poor Steve, he's heard this over and over again. But you know, you're looking at merchantability, you're looking at some kind of consistent results every day, and the only way you measure that is just like you measure a math problem with math. You measure, you know, just fermentation or distillation problems with chemistry. For me, you know, when I'm consulting and working on I'm taking my first stab at agave spirits, and so having the chemistry numbers on those are essential for me, because that's how I don't know agave, right? And so, but when they send me the numbers back and I have like gas chromatography done on it, and I have that torn down, and I look at it overall, I'm like, oh, okay. But I'm no chemist, right? I use it just it's a tool for me to not waste a lot of time, you know, especially when I'm trying to diagnose something for someone else or for a client that is having trouble. You know, I've learned the hard way that I can diagnose and spend a lot of time going back over fermentations and trying to break those down. If I send it out in the first place to a very dear friend of mine that's a chemist, you know, he will take it and tear it down for me and then send it back to me, and then we can rebuild it from a more artistic way. Does that make sense? You know, because he's sending this back to me, so I don't have to waste any more time on it. Like, okay, now I see where we're going, and now we can make this more beautiful because, you know, we know what's happening in the background right now. So, yeah, I can't live without it these days. I did for a long time, you know, like, you know, formal chemistry, but I don't do it myself. But it's certainly a tool for me. But it's so interesting too. You talk about historic distilling too, how much they knew intuitively. You know, they knew they needed, you know, a certain acid level. They didn't know what number they needed. They just knew by the taste of it that's the fermentations that made the best whiskey and made more money because it was the most merchantable, and that's what increased their, you know, improved their reputation and made them sought after. And, you know, so it you know, but they didn't know that's what they were doing. They didn't know they were doing basic pH chemistry, or they didn't know they were doing basic, you know, whatever. But yeah, they do it. We're starting to do it intuitively, which is pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that's true of most historic trades, and I think that's how you got regionalism. You know, no matter what it is, whether you're talking about distilling, we're talking about woodworking, blacksmithing, all those trades. It's like people learn by doing, and that's how you got those unique characteristics. And sometimes I wonder if we're lost with everything becoming so standardized.
Yeah.
I also think that the immigration into this country brought different schools and methods. And,
Absolutely.
and so you talk about distillation of how to distill. I think that that's led to strength in our country, whatever trade, you know, because you can imagine maybe you're of English descent and you get apprenticed to a German blacksmith outside Philadelphia. You're going to learn something.
We learn new stuff.
A little different way.
Yep.
And that gives a lot of strength. And you know, the old melting pot idea, I think, is why those early eras of American growth and industry became so vital, because it was a proving ground based on merit.
Right.
And merchantability. Yeah.
I see that a lot in studying Indiana distilling history, and, you know, obviously Kentucky, et cetera. You know, you're going to see that everywhere, anywhere where there were, you know, multiple cultures living. But when I go back and look at what some of the old Indiana distillers were doing, although they were predominantly, you know, German ancestry, I can pick out things that they picked up from the Welsh and things that they picked up from the Irish, and, you know, little pieces here and there. And I agree with Brian's assertion. I think industrialization, especially the introduction of low rectification column stills, caused us to lose some of that knowledge with some of the more commercial things, such as bourbon. Everybody has an idea of bourbon as what it is now, you know, based upon 6 or 7 large distilleries that made it through Prohibition, which were the more industrialized distilleries. But I've said this many times, if you went back, you know, to the 1850s, 1860s, even us craft distillers that are doing some really sort of crazy off the wall sort of things, there's not anything that any of us are really doing that's new. There was a farm distiller somewhere in one of these states that's already done that, and it just got forgot about, even if it made really good product, because of industrialization. And sometimes the best, in my opinion, the best whiskeys are sometimes made by people who have never made whiskey before, so they don't know that they shouldn't make it that way, you know. So why not apply something from brandy?
Just out there going, oh great, I am not making fruit brandy, and I'm not making whiskey. I'm just going to put the whole stuff together and make it right.
Right.
You know,
right. Split brandies.
Well, guys, this time to throw it back to Colonel Clark to lead us in some more toasts.
I'm glad you said plural, Brian.
Colonel?
Thank you, Brian. You all are making some great points. It was a very natural segue into my first toast. My own words to Governor Patrick Henry as I was levying for supplies, men, and money for the campaigns in the Illinois Territory. My words to him were, great things have been affected by a few men well conducted. Here's to great things.
Wow.
And on a lighter note, to choosing your battles. An English gentleman long famous for his aptitude in puns, observing a violent fracas in front of a gin shop, facetiously termed it the Battle of a Gin Court. Choosing your battles.
That's awesome.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Colonel. We've got a couple of questions to kick us off into the next segment. Dan Schofield wants to know, what about a log still?
Hey, Dan Schofield.
Yeah, what's up, Dan?
Yeah.
Distillery Trail. Great website.
All
Yes,
right.
log stills were incredibly common. I don't know that much about them on the East Coast, although I would imagine they were probably used. I can speak at them from the Indiana sort of standpoint, which was a lot of times when immigrants were coming into the state of Indiana, they might only have money or have inherited a small copper pot still, let's say 20 to 40 gallons. Because they were mostly German, they were obviously very well of the concept of double pot still distillation, so they would need a large stripping still and have the money to pay for a copper stripping still. So there are several different ways that log stills can be put together. The common way in Indiana was quite a bit different from what was normally used in Kentucky. The Indiana version was usually, and there is an extant still body for one of these still in existence at Spring Mill State Park at the distillery. They would usually find a beech tree that was hollow. They would cut it down. They would use that hollowed out trunk of the tree as the pot. They would usually have enough money to buy copper, possibly for the bottom and for the top. They would then take their small doubling still, actually place the worm into the stripping still, the hollowed out tree, and then run water, steaming water, through the little doubling still in order to heat the wooden pot still up. So basically indirect steam heat is what they're doing. And then, obviously you'd have to have a line arm, usually made out of copper. A lot of times the worms for those stills are actually made out of pewter, believe it or not. I see reference to that more than I do copper in Indiana. But that was a very common thing that they did to save money until they were able to build up enough money to buy a nice large copper stripping still at that time. And those were used even up to Prohibition in some places in southern Indiana that I know of. And after that point in time, they also used some wooden 3-chamber stills, which were pretty common. Also used a lot in Maryland with rye whiskeys. So
Interesting. And also, does regional microbiome climate dictate successful yeast types?
What's the question? You're garbled a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Does regional microbiome / climate dictate successful yeast types?
Absolutely.
maybe.
What I'm finding distilling here, feet away from, Red Hook is close to where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Hudson River. And it's really interesting what we're finding right now. I have changed up our yeast. I've layered a couple of them together. Yeah, there's things that I've never seen before and smelled before here in good ways, but certainly the salt water is influencing us, and I don't know what the chemistry is behind it.
Yeah,
I will. What? I will look into that this week and get back with you on that, Brian. I'll send the answer to that.
I think maybe what he's driving at with the question, I don't know. If you guys have obviously probably seen where Veach wrote about Kentucky in particular being ideal for the type of yeast that make bourbon, kind of like sourdough and California. I don't necessarily prescribe to that because there's certainly been a lot of whiskey and a lot of brandy made all over the world using the yeast that's available in that area. It's more about finding the right yeast for that area and the type of product that you want to make. So maybe Kentucky to some extent for sure is ideal for yeast for bourbon as we currently think of bourbon. But again, I think that has more to do with the industrialization and 6 or 7 of those big distilleries surviving Prohibition. And what we currently think of as that concept of bourbon than it does that other states can't provide their own yeast, that are ideal for their type of bourbon whiskey.
Absolutely. Yeah. But climate, what I'm finding is climate is absolutely a huge influence in what I'm when I make
Yes.
those decisions.
I know, Steve, you were the one who really introduced me to the whole process. And I remember I was with you guys for 3 days, and each day, even though we'd done the same thing, everything smelled and acted differently.
Yeah, it's true. And it goes back to the function of the space you're working in and the climate you're working in, and working in wood fermenters as well. I mean, there's a lot of challenges there that Lisa's helped us overcome those, but we had some pretty interesting things growing on top of some fermenters in the early years. And, you know, and then being so new at it, I'd look in there and say to Dave Pickrell, is that really supposed to, and even some inside of me was like, is it really supposed to look like that? I'd take a lot of photographs. I'd take a photograph and go home and go, that can't be what I want. And, anyway, we've made a progress on that to where we're cleaner, which helps so much. But part of it is what leads to the flavors we get in our whiskey. You know, I've learned enough to know that having certain things grow in there is not a bad thing, the right amount. You just don't want to have it overtake your mash. Or we also learned early on, don't migrate mash rakes. You know, you got a problem in row 3, and if you move it over, I have to watch some of my staff. I go, that rake needs to stay there, because you'll just migrate it through the whole batch.
Yeah.
So
Did anybody else just imagine Steve with a ruler, like the school teacher? No.
no, it's actually a 6-foot-long mash rake, which is more effective. But, like,
I've seen it firsthand. Yeah.
a little story about managing staff that goes with this tale is that my last boss, who's now head of Montpelier, James Madison's home, he helped me out with a problem employee a few years ago, because his phrase was, some people just don't see the ore coming. and I was glad the day that the ore that my boss finally swung for me, and that person's no longer with us. So, but most of the guys in there and girls in there now are really know what we're doing. So it's a very learned crew, but it, like anything, it took a while. Brian, when you came, was pretty early in our efforts, and you got a taste of how much manual labor is involved in it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think I prefer it, honestly. It's like I love visiting everybody I can, where everybody has. But it's like I'm somebody who doesn't like to not be doing something, and so I really like that hands-on thing. I actually liked that if there wasn't anything else you were supposed to be doing, you were supposed to be rowing the mash, and just knowing that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. I really like that part of the process.
Yeah, and I think the other part is when it's broken down to its such elements of its basic nature. A lot of distillers I've worked with that run modern plants or more modern, they love the fact that it's in its basic elements.
Exactly.
And you're seeing every ingredient go in. That means something to them. They've all, to a T, men and women have mentioned that to me.
Yeah.
And that makes me feel good that they love coming, we learn, and also they get the type of experience like that.
You understand it on a visceral level that you just don't get.
Right.
Like, yeah.
You have to break it down in a different way, and that's what makes it fun too. And I'm my background with growing up in the family that I did and the home distilling that they were into, it, that's one thing that I don't like about what I do for a living is that it's indoors and it's mechanized, and whereas growing up it was outdoors, or at least that was part of the appeal of it. You were still involved in nature to a different extent than what you are in a modern facility, and you were at the whim of having to do everything manually and realizing what actually was going into the whiskey. And now, got mash tuns with agitation. You don't have to do any of that. And I prefer it the other way. I don't know that I could keep up with it every day.
Well, guys, we've had we're by no means close to finish, but it just occurred to me that we came for a regional showdown. Talked about, and we kind of migrated into each other, with the exception of Aaron, who really threw down on us really effectively, and I appreciate it. So what does this tell us about regionalism in distilling? How much we've kind of all melded together, and it's like we came in thinking that we were all very distinct, and is that what we're finding?
No, we're all very intertwined, especially with the growth of the United States and how all that happened. It's really hard to separate it all out. And the more Steve and I have worked on a couple you know, we're working on a couple things, right? And we've talked about that over and over again. It's just remarkable how these migration patterns and things went to this place or that place, or immigrants that came in and, you know, brought their own influences, or you know, yeah, it's hard to break it out and put it into a specific category.
I think in modern times, it's a little bit of both. So it's definitely everything that Lisa just said. But the interesting thing about the craft spirits movement is that, you know, we're kind of going back to what distilleries were in the 1800s to some extent. So while, you know, us craft distillers might be offering our spirits in multiple different states, we're also definitely bringing back those regional styles. I think that this whole modern COVID thing has obviously made people, even people who don't drink, realize that distilleries should probably be part of their local food shed as well. And, you know, but obviously distillers all get together and we share things back and forth. And, you know, that exchange of ideas that we talked about and the way that you can pick out different ideas, it's still happening. I talk to distillers all over the world all the time, and they've all got something that they can teach me. And I've got something I can learn from every one of them. And that's part of the beauty of doing this whole thing. So
I frequently say it's an old winemaking term that was 10 winemakers, 1 room, 14 opinions. And I always say distillers are worse. 10 distillers, 1 room, 18 opinions. Right?
right, right.
Like I tell my team, I always want exactly like that, except for when I want it exactly like that. Right?
Right.
Right?
18 opinions, then one guy currently writing a thesis in his head.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with sort of the regional connections. I mean, we like to look back at history and separate it all, whether chronologically or categorically, but in the past, people live their lives similar to us in that we have a myriad of blended experiences and tastes and thoughts and influenced by people throughout our lives, and everything. There are so many nuances, even with just in distilling, that everything is kind of connected in some way, even though I think Monongahela Rye is a category all its own.
I think you were right.
You are right, I have to admit. Yeah.
Yes.
But what's nice too is everyone I've met has come to work with us at Mount Vernon. The passion for it's there, so everybody loves to share. I mean, the only other thing I've experienced that with is my mill friends. When I go overseas and hang out with the Dutch windmillers or the Germans, we love mills so much. Everybody's on the same page, and I feel that with the distillers.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to talk about it and learn from each other. And that type of camaraderie has been super fun for me.
It's also a trade that invites people to do deep dives. You know, I think, I mean, you can do deep dives in any kind of trade, really, if you're a woodworker or whatever. But I think that there's so much variability and so much cultural influence from the different cultures who have contributed that, I mean, it's an endless rabbit hole, you know, and you can start from the beginning and you can know nothing. Even as a home hobby distiller, you know, maybe you're just making sugar shine, which is the most basic thing you can do. If you're into this for, you know, 5 or 6 years and you really learn what you're doing, you can go back to the very beginning of everything that you started, and you can do everything that you did there, but you can do it in an informed way and make a very different product because now you have some understanding, some basic understanding of what is possible from even those most basic tools.
True.
Well, this was not this big reveal was not supposed to be like a part of this wonderful kumbaya thing we've got going on here. Great. It never went so well with like the Macho Man and Hulk Hogan. But yeah, it's time for another drink, and I'm a bourbon guy, so I was gonna reach for some more bourbon from my region.
Yeah, I think everybody forgot that, you know, we have this thing between Southern Indiana and Northern Kentucky called Kentuckiana. It's really just one region, and there's no such thing as Southern Indiana. It's just Hoosier occupied Northern Kentucky till you get up to about Columbus. So much like the Macho Man and Hulk Hogan, Brian and I have decided to form the Mega Powers. So there it is.
Kentuckiana.
Kentuckiana, brother.
This is
with
excellent.
unpretentious whiskey.
This is unpretentious. We very safely and you know, following COVID guidelines, my fiance and I spent 4 hours on the road to pick this up after we heard Alan describe it and what was happening with it. So very good stuff from Spirits of Princeton. Well, we are right on target. Do we want to talk a little bit about, before we move into the tease of the next one, because this is always a fascination with me, and I know all of us talk about it, what have we lost regionally past Prohibition? Obviously, that was a game changer as far as the landscape, whether it's in, I mean, Aaron touched on it in Pennsylvania. We touched on it with the apple orchards in Indiana. We know we're talking about regionalism now. We've touched on a little bit, but what is a little bit of the spirit culture that was very much a part of the agriculture that was going on in these different regions? It was an expression of that agriculture. What have we lost?
Specific fruits that were grown for making spirits. Yeah, specific fruits, specific grains. You know, the markets weren't there. And Kentucky is an example. Kentucky has one of the oldest wine traditions in the United States. Nobody knows it because Prohibition wiped out the wine industry in Kentucky. It's one of the major producers before Prohibition, and everyone was too poor after Prohibition to do anything but grow tobacco or corn for whiskey because they were one-year cash crops, where reestablishing a vineyard would be 3 to 5 years. And so, yeah, so things like that, right? There's a, outside of Bardstown, there's a French Trappist monastery that was established in the 1840s. And they tended a vineyard there for 100 years with actually some vinifera, some French vinifera. And you know, all of that, they actually made it through Prohibition, but barely. And, but all of that's been lost. And so people were just stunned, right? That Kentucky actually grows some pretty fabulous grapes.
They really do. That when I previously worked at Copper and Kings, there were some fantastic grapes that we were able to get a hold of from Kentucky that made excellent brandy, without a doubt. But I agree with what Lisa said. I also think that, yeast strains, I mean, there was nobody made it through in my 6-county region, the Black Forest of Southern Indiana. Nobody made it through Prohibition. And so I've been lucky enough to recapture what I think are some of those historic yeast strains that are very, back to that earlier question, very, predominant in the environment and very reflective of the terroir of Southern Indiana. Knowledge is a major factor, especially here for us in Southern Indiana, because the temperance movement was massive here. And so not only did they shut down the distilleries, but they also tried to erase a lot of the history in particular. And to the extent that, you may talk to a descendant now whose grandfather was a distiller, and they've not even been told that there was ever a distillery there on the property or that their family was ever involved in it, because it almost became something to be ashamed of. And so just the vast amount of knowledge, operational knowledge, I'm the only distiller in that 6-county region. There's no other distilleries here. And so I have to kind of dig into it as historian and distiller to learn what that methodology was and how to bring it back to life to some extent. And that can be a little bit hard when there's not a whole lot of references or people that you can talk to and you can ask those questions of. And then much like Kentucky with the vineyards, as I mentioned earlier, the 1855 census for Southern Indiana, the agricultural census mentions in each of those 6 counties upwards of 155,000 apple trees. That I know of in those 6 counties right now. There's only one remaining orchard that is a commercial orchard that was somewhat tied to the distilling industry. The rest of them are gone because these were primarily farm distillers. These apples weren't good to eat out of hand. So when Prohibition hit, they may have all known it was a joke and known it was coming to an end at some point in time, but they still had to make money. So they cut their trees down and they planted commodity crops. And who knows how many unique varieties of apples, existed that may have been traded back and forth that made a superior brandy, just like in Normandy, France. And that stuff, there's no getting that back. That's gone forever. That'll never come back. So.
Yeah, to that I'll add for us here specifically, there were a couple distilleries who fulfilled rum orders for the federal government for medicinal spirits throughout Prohibition, and that only happened 2 or 3 times. But by far and away, most of the distilleries closed, of course, and only a handful reopened following repeal, and they were all gone by the 40s and 50s. So all the distilleries that produce Monongahela rye whiskey were gone. And what that leads to us now is something else I'll add is collective memory, kind of what Alan said, but with historic interpretation. Now we face reintroducing local folks to their distilling history, to this part of their heritage that has been largely overshadowed by bigger industries like steel and coal mining. But we reintroduce them to that. And if people have heard of whiskey distilling in Western Pennsylvania, it is the whiskey insurrection. It is about the 18th century. And there's this sort of idea that distilling in Western Pennsylvania stopped following the whiskey insurrection. But we could say because of Prohibition, now we face that challenge of reintroducing that part of their heritage to them.
I would say in Virginia, it's interesting that there's an image of George Washington used by a temperance movement where the original drawing, he has his hand on a barrel and they scrubbed out the barrel. So Washington's own heritage of his own distilling was erased at that time and really not talked about. And then in Fairfax County, where Mount Vernon's located, after Prohibition, this became a dairy county. All the grain went away. Now it's a high-tech area near DC, but it was all dairy farms, all from the 30s up through the time of the 70s. And then you have the slow growth of distilling again, one with A. Smith Bowman coming back online. But there was still, when I worked out at another mill out in Western Fairfax County, there were still some big dairy farms. And now that's all turned into neighborhoods, but it really just changed the whole agricultural landscape of the county.
Another piece that disappeared that I should have added, and Lisa, I'd like to hear your commentary on this, because I don't know that I've ever read about it in New York, but I bet it's the case. Some of the technology, some of the distilling technology disappeared. So when Indiana hit Prohibition, those guys had converted mostly from pot stills over to 3-chamber wooden stills. And, that had become kind of the in-between industrialization sort of thing that they were doing. So not only did those stills disappear, but all the knowledge of how to run those stills and make that apple brandy from those stills disappeared with it. And I suspect that that's going to take a young distiller getting into it who is very inventive and creative, someone like Todd Leopold, who is running a 3-chamber in Colorado, to really reinvent that wheel one day.
Well, guys, this has been such a interesting conversation. I didn't want to stop us short, but just a little bit of a teaser. We don't know if it's going to be Punch Bowl 4 or if it's going to be a future episode. We were going to tease it a little bit tonight. We're going to take a whole different track, and we're going to talk about gin coming up. So does anybody want to say a few words just to kind of whet everybody's palate for this conversation about gin? Alan did a whole
delicious.
Well,
it is delicious.
There's evidence the Dutch were making it in Manhattan in 1626, so we could start there.
Yeah.
1640s in Brooklyn. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
The Americas really struggled to make what they considered a very good gin for a long time. It seemed to be the one spirit that we really had a hard time kind of figuring out, probably because of trade and getting the right ingredients, more than likely, because nowadays everybody's making gin and most people are making really good gins, but we certainly struggled to figure that one out for a little while.
A lot of what we're going to be talking about is not what you really think of as the common gin today. London Dry Gin didn't really become our main import until the 1890s. And so there was a whole period of gin for a long time before that. It's a very interesting story. So we hope you guys will join us for that. Do we have any final remarks from any of our panelists before we move into questions?
I wanted to ask one question of Lisa and Alan about Prohibition and the impact not on the equipment, but on aging and maturation, because when those warehouses shut, there were barrels that stayed there a long time. And how did that affect the industry coming out of Prohibition as far as what was considered a good aging profile?
I don't know a lot about it. The little bit that I know that I've been taught or told is that a lot of that at 13, Prohibition was 13 years long, right? So a lot of those spirits literally just evaporated. Some of them, the temperance movement, actually the government went in and destroyed entire warehouses. But a lot of people considered it unpalatable at that point in time. I don't know how much of it actually, Alan may know, I don't know how much of it actually hit the market. Just because it was what anybody was used to being that old.
What about the medicinal whiskeys then, that by prescription you get those? They would have been some of it released, right?
Turned over really quickly. Yeah.
That's my understanding, was that there wasn't a whole lot like Lisa said, there wasn't a whole lot left over after Prohibition, partially because of everything she mentioned, plus a lot of theft. There was a ton of theft.
Yeah, absolutely,
Um,
absolutely. And if you had a whole warehouse of barrels and it was Prohibition, you know, I'm sure that one a week would disappear, right? You know,
Right.
Your
And then
you know, during the Depression, Prohibition, and yeah.
the medicinal side of it too, I think they were, you know, in my opinion, I mean, it wasn't that hard to get medicinal whiskey, so they were selling through their stocks pretty quick. I mean, they did a distilling holiday in 1929 to allow the distilleries to fire back up, and of course, most of them didn't have functioning equipment at that point. And I know, for example, the APH Stitzel distillery, when Prohibition did end, and they started reintroducing bourbon, I can't remember the exact ages. Lisa, you might be able to say, because I don't know, but I know when they first started reintroducing bourbons, they were doing them at a younger age, you know, and we're talking just a few months. And then after that, it was like a year old. And after that, it was 2 years old. And so it definitely affected that flavor profile. As far as like the apple brandy in Indiana, the unfortunate thing is the distilleries I know of that wanted to get back in the business, because brandy was at such a premium before Prohibition. The Wolfs and the McCoys, for example, both had 300 plus barrels at the old APH Stitzel warehouse, and at the end of Prohibition, somebody had stolen all of that brandy out from underneath of them, so they couldn't even get back in the game.
Wow.
Well, it's like I discussed too. I've got these two huge record books, right? They're this thick, and they, like I said, they go from 1934 to and several name changes. Part of it's Buffalo Springs, right, which is now Buffalo Trace, and I bought these at a garage sale.
That's so cool.
Yeah, what a find, right? And but those early whiskeys at 1934, 1935, that's where you see those references for oak chips. You know, so they didn't have stocks of old whiskey they were selling. They were trying, as Alan was saying, trying to shove younger whiskeys out with some color in them, right?
Supposedly that's when they started really pushing the wheated bourbons as well, because they were basically saying that a wheated bourbon, you know, they thought they could get that out at a younger age, etc. Which is kind of funny, because nowadays a lot of distillers will come out with a rye whiskey at a younger age because they think it's more palatable. But back then the idea was the exact opposite, that a wheated bourbon was going to be more acceptable at a very young age than anything with a lot of rye in it.
Interesting.
How did importing look at that point? Since, you know, obviously Scotland, Canada, I mean, maybe they had some better. They hadn't had that hiccup. It's like, did we rely on that more?
If you knew the right people out of Chicago, definitely.
Right. Well, some questions that we've got. Michael Robinson would like to know, is the same true of local grains, in particular male Ted barley, like we talked about with yeast earlier?
I think he means malted barley.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. It
That's right.
came through funny on the thing. Yeah.
Yes, terroir is definitely there in the grain and has always been there in the grain, and especially with pot still distillation. Pot still distillation early on, obviously everybody was doing that, and it's all about retention and concentration of flavor and making heavier bodied spirits. And so you could have, you know, barley variety that you were going to malt that was grown in one state, and you could run it on a pot still in that state, and then go to a different state, have the same variety of barley, run it on the same kind of pot still, same basic design, and they're going to taste different from one another just because of the minerals in the soil, the environment they're grown in, plus the microenvironment, microbiome of the distillery. That all affects everything.
I grow the same corn in 3 states. I grow it in Pennsylvania, I grow it in upstate New York, and I grow it in Kentucky. And, you know, it's open pollinated heirloom cross, and it's remarkable. 2 years ago, we planted it all the same week. It was just coincidence that it all went in the ground within the same 3 or 4 days. And the harvest window was 7.5 weeks between where we harvested first in Kentucky, we harvested second in Pennsylvania, and we harvested third in New York. But the corn there's a market difference in the corn.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
So what about, sorry.
No, it's fun. Yeah. You know, everybody that argues there's no terroir in whiskey, it's like, there's no way that there's terroir in whiskey, right? Yeah.
Lisa, out of curiosity, I have a question on that. Those different, you know, times that you grew corn in different states, are you guys going to do any of that as like individual expressions from each state, or will that come out through different?
I don't
Yeah.
know yet. I'm putting down all kinds of stuff, and yeah, that, you know, that's even my bosses ask me that. Like, what are you going to do with that? Like, I don't know.
'Cause that would be great. That'd be
Yeah.
fantastic. to be able to
We will always
so,
do something like that from distillery releases, just because that, you know,
Yeah.
we do those things just so people can understand and get their head around. But we don't do this for, you know, major distribution by any means. So.
Yeah.
So what about cooperages and availability of oak staves? Is that a problem?
It was a few years ago,
Yeah.
wood shortage, but I don't know
Just go back
about,
to Aaron's.
you know, earlier times.
Yeah.
Aaron made a point
Most-
earlier about prohibition, about all those other the other industries, the shipping, the glassworks, the cooperages kind of taking a hit at that point. So does that play into it too?
Yeah. Early on, a lot of the distilleries, usually every town would have a cooper on hand that could do dry coop and wet coop work. So everybody was really using, a lot of times in the early days, they're using the same barrels from the same person. Is an interesting aside on cooperages and wood in relation to rye whiskey from Virginia. Steve and I've told Steve about this before. I think the rye whiskey mash bill, the George Washington mash bill, it also shows up in southern Ohio and southern Indiana, but it is rarely ever put into oak barrels. It's almost always put into hickory barrels for some reason. And I still don't know, and I would love to know what that would do to it. Who knows?
Yeah, everybody, I mean, Steve can talk to this, that, you know, barrels were used for shipping, right? So everybody had a cooperage, and, you know, every community had a cooperage, because if they weren't shipping whiskey in it, they were shipping flour.
Yeah.
Large.
Steve,
Big
didn't
port.
Washington ship fish in that as well? Didn't he do his?
Yeah, he had a cooperage at the distillery, and they had a cooperage on the edge of his farm where one of the creeks fed into the Potomac, where he had a fish house. And so he had 4 commercial fisheries. So they, you know, worked both ends of the trade. But we all know that story. You can burn a fish barrel, it's still going to smell like fish. So maybe whoever received the barrel on the other end in Norfolk, Virginia, or the Caribbean could decide what they want to put in it next.
There was a distillery, a craft distillery here in Indiana that did a fish barrel not too long ago, and
Really?
it was what you would expect. So
Sold real well, huh?
yeah. I actually had to do the absinthe mouth rinse afterwards.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Well, Dan Schofield wants to know, Lisa, have you tried to age the same bourbon in 3 states?
No, I haven't. I'm aging it in 2 states. I haven't done it in 3. I can definitely, maybe I'll ship some somewhere. That's a good, you know, I hadn't even thought about that, quite frankly, just because of my logistics, but I'm certainly willing to put it in a different state. Yeah, in different places too, because we're aging, you know, what we're laying down here in New York right now, we're putting in our warehouse, and it's, you know, I've you know, I think you probably all heard this from me before. You walk a block and a half from our distillery now, you can see the Statue of Liberty. That's how close we are to the water. And yeah, you know, Valentino Park is under 2 blocks, and you can be on the waterfront there. And so I am finding some really interesting things, especially, and I just today received some of my barrels from Kentucky that I laid down a couple of years ago there, so I could contrast them to what I'm doing here.
Lisa, Alicia says that we have room in our barrel room, so we can definitely help you with that.
Yeah. Hey, don't count me out on that. Hey, Alicia, if you mean it, you mean it.
There's a new mega power, Brian. There's a new mega power.
Yes.
Yeah, they want to have a real show now.
The new Kentuckiana.
Yeah. You know what? I have some that I've separated out, that Pennsylvania corn intentionally, you know, that we've run in New York, and because I can't label it the same way if it's not 75% from New York. So you know what? I think this is a good idea. How much room do you have?
I could see a new brand, Monongah Hudson Rye.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Colonel Clark, are you there for our final toast?
Of course. First, let me say thank you for the most prestigious honor of being a Toastmaster, and certainly being in the presence of knowledge on a subject that I myself have been quite interested in, and the opportunity to turn back a few glasses. I will finish with a quote from Sir Thomas Overbury. "A man who has not anything to boast of but his illustrious ancestors is like a potato. The only good belonging to him is underground. Here's to being unlike a potato.
Yes.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Colonel. Do any of our panelists have any toasts that they would like to share?
I have kind of a toast. It's part toast, part another mic drop, but it's an excerpt from a document that was written in the early 1900s by a Monongahela Rye distillery employee, and I'll just quickly read it. He said, "Sit down, my friend, and ask for a choice, real old rye, a nectar fit for the gods. Pour it slowly, feast your eyes on its golden hues. Is it the golden fleece for which the Argonauts of old strived? Inhale its exquisite aroma. Enjoy its superb bouquet. It brings to the mind's eye the smiling rye fields, the rye waving joyously in the sun, and the troop of happy children passing through. Look again, and the liquid amber, coupled with the word Monongahela, brings remembrances of George Washington, who also owned the distillery, and the stirring days of the whiskey insurrection. Look again, and you see another of the immortals, Lincoln, selling it. Pour a little more, that is incense indeed. See the crown of nature's beads that puts a diadem on King Rye. It is the essence of summer days concentrated in crystal, a proper palace for King Rye." So, to King Rye.
King Rye.
Here, here.
Cheers.
I don't know if I'm allowed to pronounce a winner, but I think that Rye was pretty most fervently fought for tonight, and really impressed.
Yeah. I will forgo the claim of the 6-county region in favor of Pennsylvania Rye at the moment.
That
Me
was impressive.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Aaron did it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us here again for the third Punch Bowl. We are by no means done. We've got plenty of material left to go. Look out for Punch Bowl 4. Also watch your email for contact information about our panelists, and I'll be getting with you guys for that. And thanks everybody for joining us, and have an excellent evening, and looking forward to seeing you back next time.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, guys.